Hi everyone, it's James here, and in today's lesson we're going to be building this JavaScript image slider, and we'll build it completely from scratch. There's no jQuery or any of the frameworks involved in this, and although you can get those kind of pre-built JavaScript image sliders built for you and just plug them into a framework, this is going to be a good exercise, and we're going to learn lots of different things about JavaScript and how to handle elements on the page. And we're going to, right at the end of the tutorial, put in some nice little additional features like the autoplay and also the shortcut selections, which you can see on these dots at the bottom of the image slider. So let's get started, and with this project's available on GitHub, and there's a link in the description below. And once you've cloned the repository, you can simply get to the start point for this project simply by going to the setup branch. And if you go back to the page, you can see we've simply got a blank page at the moment. So we're going to do this in several different steps, and we're going to build it up as we go along. The first thing we're going to do is add in some markup and start playing around with the styling, and then we'll gradually add in bits of JavaScript to actually handle the processing of the images and how they slide from one to the next. So you can see the repository's already got some images in there for us. Feel free to replace those if you like. They just come from Unsplash, but any sort of image that you want to use is fine. And what we're going to do in our markup is actually add those into a containing element. So the way the slider works is we've actually got two elements inside each other, and the actual inner container element is going to be the one that's containing the images, and that's going to be moved left and right depending on which slide you're looking at. And the containing element is actually going to clip any images that overflow from it, so it kind of gives the effect that it's been hidden from view. So the first element I'm going to create is a div, and I'll give that a class of slider so that we can target it with our CSS a bit later on. And we're going to have that container element inside there, which is actually going to contain the images. So I'm going to add those images in, and each image is in the image folder. So there's one, and I think there was 5 altogether. Of course, you can add as many as you like. The JavaScript code that we're going to write will work out how many images are actually in this container. So feel free to put as few or as many as you like in there. So the next thing we're going to do is put some controls in here so we can actually go to the next and previous slides. So again, we'll have another element inside here called slider controls. I'm going to just put a couple of buttons in there for the moment. So we'll have one button that has a class of previous. And I'm just going to say previous for now. We're going to change these up as we go along, but just so we've got some placeholder buttons that we can use. And we're also going to have a next button to take us to the next slide. So that's pretty much all we need for our markup. And if we look at the page now, you can see the images are actually there. They're very large, actually. We should probably have used some smaller ones. But you get the idea. Those images are on the page ready for us to use. So I'm going to create 2 new files now. I'm going to create, first of all, I'm going to create a JavaScript file called slider.js, which will contain the main bulk of our slider code. And I'm also going to create a style.scss file as well. And what I'm going to do, which for reasons you'll see in just a second, is I'm going to create an app.js file, and this will be the main code that's loaded into our index file. So we can do that now. Let's just load that in here. Script source, and it's app.js. And up here, we're going to add in the CSS file, or rather the Sass file. So we've got a parcel running here just to show you. So in the package.json, to actually serve this, if you just run npm run serve, and it will run this parcel command for us, and it'll handle all of the JavaScript and Sass processing for us. Okay, so that won't make any difference to our code at the moment. So the first thing we're going to do is actually start work on the slider JavaScript file. And the reason I create these 2 files is because what I'm actually going to do here in the slider.js file is to actually create a new class. So I'm going to say export default class slider, should I say? And this is going to be a new class that we're going to be instantiating to get our slider up and running. Now the reason I'm doing this is just from a kind of purely educational point of view, although this does answer a question that someone asked on the channel a little while ago, which was how do I kind of make my code a bit more reusable and make it packageable to be able to be sent to other apps or other developers. So by separating all of our slider logic and code into a separate class file, we can actually reuse it in other projects later on. So what we're then going to do in our app.js file, we can then import that. So we can say import the slider from, and it's in slider. And then all we need to do in here is make a new slider object. So before we start working on the JavaScript properly, what we should actually do is go and create some styles to actually start displaying the images as we would like to see them. So the first thing we're going to do is target that slider element that we've created. So that's the outer container, and we'll set a maximum width of that of 600 pixels. This is something you could put into your JavaScript configuration if you want, but we're going to hard code it into the CSS for now. And of course you can choose any width that you like really. And just to make sure that the elements are central, we'll set a top and bottom margin of 0 and the left and right as auto. And finally, just for the moment, I'm going to set the display to flex and the flex direction to column. And that's just so that we can see those control buttons at the bottom for previous and next. And if we just look at the image now, you can't really see much difference. They're still stacked on top of each other. So what we actually need to do is target the inner slider container. So slider container was the element name. And we're going to do a few things here. First of all, we're going to set it to flex, and that will automatically default to row. So you should see their images are now stacked left to right instead of on top of each other. And we're going to make sure the images are a bit smaller by setting their maximum width to 100%. And I'm going to set a maximum height of the slider container to 400 pixels. We could move this to the outer slider element, but just for the moment, because we've got those button controls and they're sitting down here instead of on top of the images, it's just handy so that we can see them. So one final thing in the slider container element, I'm just going to set a transform property and set a translate value of 0. So translate is to move an element left or right or up or down on our page. And just to demonstrate in our developer tools, what we'll actually be doing with our JavaScript code is targeting that container element. And because the outer slider element is 600 pixels width, and we know that's the case, if we actually translate or move the container element back 600 pixels, you can see we kind of skip to the next slide. And if we were to change that to 1200, you can see we get the next slide. So that's how our mechanism is going to work. We're going to just adjust this translate value, depending on whether we're moving forward or backwards through our images. So back on the main slider element, I'm just going to set a couple of values here. We're going to set the overflow to hidden. And you can see by doing that, now you can see we get only one image at a time. And if we were to adjust that translate value again, 600 pixels, you can see we get a different image being displayed. And you can't see those excess images, which is what we're after, just one image at a time. So what we can do is to make a little bit of animation rather than using any keyframes or CSS animations. If we just set up a transition property, which looks at transforms when they occur, and just completes those over a short time, so for example 0.8 seconds. So we can actually just try this out in the browser now. If we go and manually edit this translate property here, and again we'll move it 600 pixels, when we hit that you can see we get that nice slide, and if we go back to 0 it takes us back to the first slide. So this is where you can be a bit more creative if you want to have some more in-depth animation for your slides as to how they happen. For example, you could have fades or more complicated animations, but for our purposes, this will do the trick. So we're going to leave our CSS for the moment and actually go and work on some of the JavaScript code. There's some more work to do here, but we'll do that once we've implemented some of our functionality. And we'll do that in our slider.js class that we've created. And the first thing we're going to do is create a constructor, which is going to take some parameters for configuring our slider. So by doing this, we can make our slider a bit more reusable and we can configure it for different applications. And what I'm going to do here is actually pass in, or it will accept an object, which will have all of our configuration details. So we want to know a few bits of information about the slider that we're working with, and we want to be able to select the outer slider element. So I'm just going to, in our object that's passed in, there'll be a property called slider selector, and I'm just going to give it a default value, so we don't need to pass this in if we want to accept these as the defaults, if we match the markup that we're already using. And we also need to get the slider container selector as well. So we'll be using that to do some of the animations or moving of the slides. And the other thing we want to know is the buttons that we've got as well. So we will need to know the previous button selector, and that was just set up with a class of .previous, and also a next selector. And in here, that was just .next for the button that we created. And we'll also give it a default transition time as well, which is something we'll be using for the autoplay feature, which we'll do towards the end of the video. So all I'm going to do in the constructor is basically set up these properties that we can use throughout the rest of the class based off of those selectors. So the first thing is to get a reference to the slider, which is document query selector, and then whatever the slider selector was. And we also want to get a reference to the slides as well. So this is going to be a query selector all that we are going to look inside of the slide container selector. So slide container selector, which is passed in, and we want to get all of the images that are inside there. And in fact, let's just get the length property of that. So this .slides will just contain the number of slides that are in our slider markup. So let's also get, we'll save a reference to the slider container selector as well. So query selector again, and we want the slider container selector. And then we also want to get the previous button. And also the next button as well, so next selector. Let's just add on BTN on there so we know what those are referring to. And now it would be really useful because we saw in the demo a second ago how to move the slides with the translate property. We just need to know how big the slider is. So we could hard code this or actually pass it in as a parameter, but there's a way we can find this out just by accessing a property on the overall slider element, and we just get its offset width. So this will hold the 600 pixels value that we can then use to move the slides one by one. I'm also going to initialize a current slide, so which slide are we currently looking at, and bearing in mind we've got an array, so we'll say the current slide is 0 rather than 1. And then I'm going to call a function which I haven't set up yet, but it's called set event listeners. And in there, this function, what it's going to do, as the name suggests, we're going to set up some button event listeners for those two button controls that we've created to move these slides forwards and backwards. So let's start off simple. We'll create a class function or a method called moveSlides. So all we need to do for that is get the slider container, which actually should probably be called slider container rather than slider container selector. So this is the element that's got the images inside it, which is what we were moving left and right before. And I'm just going to change its style, by accessing its transform property. And in there, we're just going to say we want to set that transform to translate, and we can say translate X so that we're only modifying the left and right values. And as you saw before, we need to put in a negative value to move it. So we'll say this.current slide, and then we'll times it by this.slide size. So this will work if the current slide is 0, and obviously the slide size will be 600 or whatever's been configured. Then we'll get a value of 0 here. If it goes to 1, then it'll be minus 600. If it goes to 2, we'll get 1200, and so on, and this will allow us to move between the slides. And we should also put the pixel value in there as well, because otherwise this probably won't work. So we'll just put in our template literal there, we'll just put pixels on the end of that. So that's the function that we'll use, that we'll call throughout the class to actually move the slides around. So now we're going to set up some functions that will allow us to move between the next and previous slides. So let's create a new method called nextSlide. And what we need to do is check that we're inside the bounds of the array of the images that we've got. So we're going to basically set the current slide here. So the value of the current slide that we're looking at. And we'll just say, is the current slide, is it bigger than or equal to the number of slides that we've got? -1 because it's obviously we want to look at the array, but if it is, then we've reached the end of the list of images, so we'll just set a value of 0 to set for the current slide, but if not, we'll say it's equal to the current slide +1 because we're moving forward in the array of images. And then we'll put in a call to this move slides, which will do the actual moving of the images for us. And for the previous slide, we simply do something similar. So we say the current slide is equal to, but this time we're going to say if the current slide is less than or equal to 0. It shouldn't ever get to less than, but just put it in as a safeguard. And then we basically say we want to go to the end of the slides array. So we'll say this.slides -1. Oh, I missed out the ternary question mark there. So that will put it to the last slide that we have. But if not, we want to go back to the current slide, but we want to go back one. And of course, again, we'll put in the call to move slides. So these functions need wiring up, so that's what we'll put into this setup event listeners function here. And we've already got a reference to both of the buttons, so we'll say next btn, add event listener, and we'll say click, and then we'll say this dot next slide, and the same for the previous button. We want to go to the previous slide. Now this won't work, and I'll just show you why, and what we'll do in the next slide function, we'll say console.log this. So if we go back to the page, oh, we've actually got an error here, we shouldn't be seeing that. Okay, so what we need to do, because in our constructor here, we'll just, if we don't pass anything in, which we're not in our app.js, no parameters are passed in, we'll just default that to an empty object, and that should get rid of that error, which it has. So the next and the previous buttons won't work for us at the moment, but if we click the next one, you can see there that the console.logs that we get in here, this value is equal to the button. And then when we try and call this.moveSlides, it can't find that function. So the reason for this is to do with the binding of the this special variable. And because in here we've got the value of the button, when we try and call move slides, it doesn't exist because we're trying to reference the class. So there's a couple of things we can do here. We could use arrow functions to actually use this binding that provides, or you might have seen this in other tutorials as well, where we can actually, when we call that function, the next slide function, we can bind the value of this, which will in this case be the actual class that we've created. So I'm going to take that approach because that will work nicely for us now. But if we click next, you can see now the console.log gives us the slider class that we've created, and of course the actual images are being shown to us as we click through them. And you can see when we get to the end of the array of images, we go straight back to the first one, and the previous button will take us backwards through the array. So that's pretty much the mechanism of setting up a slider. Now it's all really about kind of changing the appearance of it. But there are a few features we're going to add, such as the shortcut icons at the bottom, and also the autoplay feature as well. So let's go ahead and set up some styling first of all, and then we'll look at adding in those two features. So whilst the buttons are okay, realistically we want some icons or some images that will help us or help the user to actually navigate them. So I'm going to get rid of those for the moment. What I've actually done in the project is I've loaded in the free Font Awesome package, so that will provide us with some icons that we can use. So let's go ahead and we'll remove those two buttons. This time we'll just use a span tag, which will have a same class again, so we don't need to change any of our JavaScript code. And we'll use the Font Awesome classes that are provided to us. So there's a caret left icon, and let's just duplicate that. Next, and we'll have a right caret as well. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see those yet. There might be a little bit hidden there, but that's okay because we're going to actually use some CSS or some Sass styling to actually move that into the right place. So let's target the slider controls element, which contains those two font awesome icons. So first of all, we'll set the color to white, and we'll increase their font size a little bit there. So 3 rem should do it. And then we'll target the individual icons themselves. So what we're going to do is absolutely position these. So I'm going to say left 20 pixels, and I'm going to set up a hover event just to move it across. You'll see this in action in a second. And then with the next one, we want to put that on the right hand side. And again, we'll just set up a hover event just to move that in, so there's a little bit of animation when the user hovers over it. So I'm going to also target both of those. There's some rules that are common between the two of them. And I'm going to set a width of these. Now the reason I'm setting a width is because sometimes it can be a bit tricky to actually hit the icon to trigger the hover event, or to actually trigger our click event as well. So I'm going to set, this will just actually give them a bit of space on the page so that we can actually click them. And of course we want to make them look clickable as well. So cursor pointer. Let's set their opacity 0.75 just to fade them into the background a little bit. And then I'm going to position them in the middle of the slide container element. And so to do that, I'm going to say translate Y minus 50%, and also set their top value to 50%. So that'll just make sure that they're actually positioned exactly in the middle of those images. So this will only work if our elements are positioned absolutely. So absolute. And I'm also going to add a little bit of transition onto those as well, so that the left and right changes happen over a bit of time. So 0.3 seconds should be okay. And we just need to make sure that our slider element that has these controls is positioned relatively. So position relative. So there's one last thing we need to do just to make this work. We just need to make sure we have actually got Font Awesome imported into our project. So the way I've done it, I've just added it as a node modules, so we can access the CSS files from there. And if we import it into our Sass file, it will just compile it into our overall build. You can see parcels doing its thing there. And there you go, you can see we've got our left and right arrows. And if you hover over them, that was the effect that I was kind of going for. When you hover over them, they just move a little bit, just to give a bit of an indication that that's what will happen. And because the actual markup code hasn't changed that much, we've still got the next and previous selectors. If we actually click those buttons now, you can see that the images still change and everything works as it did before. So one of the final features we're going to add is those shortcuts, the dots along the bottom. So let's go ahead and set those up now. So whilst we're here, let's add in the CSS rules for them. So I'm going to put them all into a div element called shortcuts, which I'll position absolutely again because we want it overlaying the actual images. And we'll just shove that 20 pixels up from the bottom. Make sure it spans the whole of the slider container, and we'll just give it a bit of height as well, just to ensure that the elements display. And we'll set them as flex so that they can be centered. And then we're just going to, each one of those actual dots is just going to be an element itself, which will have a class of shortcut. So let's make them clickable, cursor pointer, and I'm going to set a background color and going to go for a white color. Of course, you can choose any sort of color that you like. And we'll set an opacity on that so that it just fades a little bit so it's not too obtrusive. And the way we get the circular elements is just to have a border radius of 50%, but it needs to have some width, so we'll say they're about 20 pixels big, and we want a bit of margin on that, not on the top and bottom, but on the left and right, just to give them a bit of separation. And there's going to be some animations on this, or some transitions. So let's just transition everything for 0.3 seconds. And of course we want some hover effects as well. So the background color, and I'm just going to make up some numbers here just so we'll get a grey color for the when someone's hovering over it. And we're also going to have a different color when we're on a particular slide. So we'll say when the slide is active. So this is just a class that we're going to add for it. The background color, and again you can choose any colors you like here. Oops, let's go an even darker grey. So that's all of the CSS that we need for those shortcuts. We just need to add them into our image slider now. Now we could do that in our markup, but the only difficulty with that is we need to match the number of dots for the number of images that we've got. So we'd need to maintain that manually if we're going to do it. So what I will do in our actual JavaScript file is I'm going to actually create those elements manually, which is quite handy as well because we can actually set up the event listeners for them for when the user clicks on them. So let's create a new method on our class and we'll call it generate shortcuts. So in here we're going to create a new element, core shortcuts. Oops, and we'll do that with document.create element. And it can be a div, it doesn't have to be anything in particular. We've got our own custom styling set up for it, and we'll do that by accessing the class list of that element. And we'll say add shortcuts. So that will apply that class for us. So what we're going to do is set up a loop, and we'll say we'll loop while our slide image limit hasn't been reached, and we're just going to add 1 to that on each iteration. So on each iteration of the loop, we're going to create a new element, a new one of those dots, which will be the shortcut. This time I'm going to create a span. Again, it could be a div, just a little bit of differentiation for us here. And for each of those dots, the first thing we're going to do is create an event listener for it. And I'm going to create a click event listener. And I'm going to inline the actual function here, so we're not going to have any problems with the this keyword like we did before. So we'll say this.currentSlide is equal to I, which is going to set the current slide value to whatever index this particular shortcut is set at. And we also, when we're actually clicking on that, we want to call the move slides function as well. So with the event listener set up, the only thing we need to do is just set up the class for it. So let's add the shortcut class that we created a second ago. And then once it's been set up, for that overall shortcuts containing element, we're just going to append each of those dots. So that loop will set up all of the necessary elements that we need for those shortcuts, and also the event listeners too. What I will also do for the overall shortcuts containing element, we'll access its first child and its class list. So this is going to be the first dot in the array of dots that we've just created. And I'm going to add that active class onto there. This will make sure that when the slider first loads, that first dot will have the active class, and we'll be able to see that that's the current slide that's being shown. So the next thing we need to do is just actually append this shortcuts container element onto the actual slider itself. And I'm also going to save those shortcuts into a variable on the class called shortcuts, which we're going to be using in a little bit. So in our constructor, we just need to make a call to generate those shortcuts, because otherwise that code will never run. So this.generate shortcuts. So all part of the initialization of the slider. And if we go back to the page, you can see those shortcuts are now appearing. So if we click on one of the shortcuts, you can see we're being taken to the appropriate slide, and you can see we can skip between slides, going right from the front to the back, which is really handy if we want to move to a specific image. And the hover doesn't seem to be working on that correctly, so let's see if we made a mistake. Yeah, okay, so we said RGAB rather than RGBA, so let's save that. Not that it makes much difference, but there you can see that hover effect is now working on those shortcuts. So one thing you probably noticed as well though is the active class isn't being updated when we select the different images from the shortcuts. So let's go and do that now. Probably the best thing to do here in this case is when the move slides function gets triggered, we know that there's been a change in the actual slide that's being displayed. So in here what we can say is the array, we'll say array from because the Shortcuts is actually a list of DOM elements, not an actual array. But for each of those, what we're going to do is just remove any active classes that are currently present. So shortcut.classList.remove active. So at this point, none of those shortcuts will have the active class. But then if we access this.shortcuts.children again, and access the element that's at the current slide, and then again it's class list, we're just going to add the active class. So this will be triggered every time the move slides function is called, and it'll just remove any active classes and make sure the current slide, or at least the current shortcut that matches the current slide, has the active class. So let's try that out. So there you can see now the active class is being updated. So that's pretty much a functioning slider for us. Everything's working as we expected. The one last thing we need to set up is the autoplay, and really this depends on whether you want to have this feature enabled or not. You could probably have a configuration variable to turn this on or off, but let's create a new function to handle this if we want to, and we'll just say set autoplay and transition time. We're going to pass that in as an argument, and all we're going to do is set an interval, and we'll say this dot next slide dot, and we need to bind this again for the same reason that we did before, and then we just say the interval is whatever the transition time is that's been passed in. So let's call that in our constructor. So this dot set autoplay, and we'll pass in that value of transition time, which is defaulted in the constructor up there. So now if we go back to the app, we should find that that's autoplay is working as expected. So the slides are just being iterated through again as they were before, and when it gets to the end it takes us back to the start, and we can still go back to slides if we need to there, or just jump between different ones. I guess what we probably should do at some point is to, because as you can see the autoplay and the user intervention is kind of fighting with each other, but we could clear that interval when the user hovers over the slider, or do some other kind of pausing of that interval if we needed to for our slider. So just to wrap up, just to show you the purpose of this constructor and those default values, what we could do in our app.js now, because this is where we actually create the new slider, we can set a transition time. Let's say if we wanted it as half a second, for example. If we save that and go back to our app, you should see, yeah, it's a bit too fast, maybe 1 second might be better. When the app loads, you can see that we're now using the custom configuration that we've passed in to the slider object when we're creating it. So that pretty much wraps up this tutorial. Hopefully you've learned a good few things about JavaScript and also some styling techniques as well. As I mentioned before, this slider class could be exported and built into a package that could be reused in other places. And there's definitely some room for improvement for things like pausing the autoplay or disabling that via a configuration parameter. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.